We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We have ignition.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff from Apollo.
Man's journey to the moon was watched by the largest audience in Earth's history. Yet few people knew that the success of the Enterprise was made possible by an extraordinary project.
Houston, you are confirmed to go for orbit.
The Gemini program was a vital early move in the unofficial international space race.
North American Aviation.
Frank Borman, please.
Astronaut Frank Borman was commander of a space mission designed to test a new craft in Earth orbit, a lunar lander. But the Apollo 8 lander was not yet ready to fly. Then Borman received a secret phone call. It came from his boss, Deke Slayton. CIA satellite photos suggested the Russians were ready to send a man around the moon before the end of the year. In August 1968, Borman was offered a dangerous new assignment.
They wanted to know if I thought we could change our mission and take Apollo 8 and go to the moon. I said, great, I'd love to do it, let's go.
One of the two men to accompany Borman was Jim Lovell.
I was ecstatic. To me, the idea of going to explore a new planet far outweighed the fear of something going wrong.
Yet there was much that could go wrong. The spacecraft, the rocket itself, navigating across 250,000 miles. Their safe return depended on a single engine. If it failed, the whole crew would be stranded at the moon. The third man on board was Bill Anders.
We had accepted these kinds of risks. I thought we had 1 chance in 3 of a successful mission, 1 chance of 3 of an unsuccessful mission yet surviving, and 1 chance in 3 of an unsuccessful mission and not surviving.
If they had died, it would have changed our view of the moon forever, knowing their bodies were up there silently circling every 2 hours, year after year.
2 minutes, 10 seconds and counting. Oxidizer tanks in the 2nd and 3rd stages now have pressurized.
No human had ever flown more than 800 miles from the Earth. Apollo 8 would travel 500,000 miles to return from the moon.
12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have
Liftoff. The clock is running.
7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I was absolutely mesmerized by what was going on. I mean, all of a sudden you find out that, my God, the crew has left the Earth's environment. Okay, it's now on a way to another planet for the first time. So, holy cow, this is something.
But when future generations look back, they may be surprised to learn why men first went to the moon. Because it was not the ancient drive to explore that inspired the landing mission.
Any idea that the Apollo program was a great voyage of exploration or scientific endeavor is nuts. People just aren't that excited about exploration. They were sure excited about beating the Russians.
In October 1957, Russia put the first man-made satellite in history into orbit, Sputnik. To many Americans, it was a shocking defeat. Pearl Harbor in space.
It is quite possible that an aggressor nation that dominates space will then dominate the world. We just can't let that happen.
We consider the control of space around the Earth very much like, shall we say, the great maritime powers considered the control of the seas in the 16th through the 18th century. And they say if we want to control this planet, we have to control the space around it.
Dr. Wernher von Braun was America's leading rocket scientist, a German engineer who created the V-2 rocket in World War II. He later worked for the US Army. For years, von Braun had dreamt of exploring space. Thanks to the Russians, he got his chance. 9 months after Sputnik, President Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. NASA announced Project Mercury, a program to put an American in space.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
The 7 Mercury astronauts became instant heroes, Cold War warriors ready to battle communism in space. Men like Alan Shepard and John Glenn were the public face of America's space program. But even the Mercury astronauts had no idea what was going on behind the scenes at a little-known NASA laboratory. The Langley Research Center in Virginia was where the journey to the moon truly began. Since the 1950s, unnoticed, a tiny group of engineers had already been planning the trips. They were called the Space Task Group, visionaries dreaming the future into being. One of them, Dr. Maxime Faget, became a legend among engineers. He helped to create every American spacecraft, including today's shuttle. In 1958, he was designing the Mercury capsule.
We expected to land on the moon sooner or later because it was so close and because everybody could see the moon. It made a very good target.
In the 1950s, travel to the moon was about to become possible because of the rocket. Rockets had become more powerful in order to carry nuclear bombs. Rockets carrying liquid oxygen would burn fuel in an airless vacuum. They could now travel through space. For an astronaut to survive there, he'd need the protection of a spacecraft or capsule. Even a small capsule would need a huge rocket to put it into space. Overcoming gravity took enormous amounts of fuel, so the rocket was divided into stages. As each one burnt, its fuel tank dropped away, saving weight. By the time the capsule finally reached space, the rocket that took it there was gone. But NASA were not the only ones with such plans. On the 12th of April 1961, the Russians put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. It was the worst defeat for America's space program since Sputnik. It increased the pressure on a young president who'd only been in office 12 weeks.
President, don't you agree we should try to get to the moon before the Russians if we can?
If we can get to the moon before the Russians, we should.
And isn't it your responsibility to apply the vigorous leadership to spark up this program?
When you say spark up the program, we first have to make a judgment based on the best information we can get whether we can be ahead of the Russians to the moon. We're now talking about a program which may be, which are many years away.
Saturn is still on a 40-hour week, isn't it, Mr. President?
Saturn is still going to put us well behind.
2 days after Gagarin's flight, at Kennedy's request, his advisor Theodore Sorensen asked NASA what space project might beat the Russians. Their answer was a moon landing.
Can we be the first to do that? Can we beat the Russians to that? They said, yes, that is sufficiently far off that the U.S. could probably, if it started now, have a chance of beating the Russians to that. That I knew Kennedy would be interested in hearing.
Sorensen reported back to Kennedy. In Sorensen's mind, it was the decisive moment.
And he said, I think we ought to try for the moon. There are a lot of tough things we've got to figure out first, but I think that would be the way to do it, if we can do it.
But not everyone agreed. An advisory committee led by top scientist Jerome Wiesner was against going to the moon, or even putting a man in space at all. Its secret report warned that the death of an astronaut could seriously embarrass Kennedy. Kennedy would keep his moon decision quiet until NASA proved an American could go into space and come back alive. That man was Alan Shepard. Unlike Gagarin, Shepard's flight was shown on live television. If he died, the whole world would be witness. An accident on the very first flight would cast a long shadow over the US space program.
Once again, hearts are beating faster and people are tensing. The signs of the final minutes of countdown.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff. Liftoff.
Fire underneath the bird and she's lifting clean. Ice coming off that redstone. You can hear the roar now. He's going up, bright flame underneath the rocket. And the rocket is going up straight.
The launch was perfect. For the next 15 minutes, the world held its breath.
Oxygen is go.
We appear to be losing voice.
During re-entry, as expected, the radio cut out. For millions of viewers, Shepard had disappeared into the unknown.
Main chute is green. Main chute is coming unraced and it looks good.
This is it. You should hear the newsmen here right now. They are absolutely screaming and shouting. They've been jumping up and down. It is a tremendously successful thing.
Shepard's flight created an enormous response. Kennedy would now make his moon decision public.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
America was headed for the moon. Not only had Kennedy made the decision, he'd set a deadline. Now it was up to the astronauts. It would take precision flying at extremely high speeds. There was little margin for error. This was why military test pilots had been selected in the first place. For the moon mission, they needed a spacecraft they could maneuver, a true flying machine controlled by the pilot. The answer was no longer the primitive Mercury capsule.
All we could do in Mercury was put it up and fire the retro rockets and bring it down. We couldn't maneuver the vehicle. We couldn't change its inclination, couldn't change its altitude, couldn't do any kind of operations in space.
By 1963, Mercury's 6 flights were over. Apollo's were still at the planning stage. Questions arose. Could craft rendezvous in space? Could humans survive a 2-week trip to the moon? Could they leave the spacecraft with nothing but a suit for protection? There was no way on Earth to resolve them. Lost between the pioneering Mercury flights and the successful Apollo moonwalks was the program that found the answers. It was called Gemini. Almost forgotten today, Gemini was the essential step to the moon.
Gemini came along as kind of a step in the middle. As a matter of fact, we were doing Mercury, people began to work on Apollo, and then a number of people realized that there was a whole bunch of things that we could do in Earth orbit that we would like to do there before we ever went and tried them at the moon.
Using a sophisticated twin-seater capsule scarcely larger than the single-seat Mercury, Gemini would test rendezvous, long-duration flight, and spacewalking. Most critical was rendezvous, meeting another craft in orbit.
Everything was based on doing a lunar orbit rendezvous. All the hardware was sized to do that. The performance of the command and service module, the lunar module, the Saturn V booster, was all based on assumptions we could successfully do a lunar orbit rendezvous, except nobody had ever done one.
In December 1965, the first attempt to rendezvous in space began. 2 Gemini flights lifted off a few days apart. It was a dress rehearsal in Earth orbit for what they'd need to do at the moon. Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford played the part of a lunar lander. They attempted to rendezvous with a mothership flown by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. Within a few hours after their launch, Schirra and Stafford could see the other spacecraft.
Hey, I think I've got it. Is that spacecraft?
Now it was in Schirra's hands. To close in, he had to maintain precise control, but every maneuver consumed precious fuel.
That's it.
The whole thing of rendezvous is exquisite timing, delicate little touches. It's all little tiny maneuvers. You had to really get in there and use both hands and pitch and roll and move and translate, and you were flying formation with it.
Separated by only a few feet, the craft moved like 2 cars driving nose to tail at over 17,000 miles an hour. Only superb control kept them from drifting apart or crashing together. A demonstration of the flair and skills called the right stuff.
Ask them what their range is now.
6, what's your range?
Yeah, we're sitting up here playing bridge together. We're in formation with 7. Everything is go here.
We did it. Roger, congratulations. Excellent. Brilliant flying. Roger.
Wally Schirra's piloting and careful use of fuel proved too that rendezvous could work.
Wally was a perfect choice for that. Went out of his way to do it by the book and exactly within and better than the fuel consumption estimates that had been made.
Following their success, Schirra and Stafford returned to Earth. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell remained in space on a 2-week long-duration flight. It was a test to see what would happen to the human body on an actual moon trip.
By the time we flew on Gemini, they knew that your eyeballs weren't going to change. They knew you could drink. They knew you could sleep. The fears were just, could you perform after, say, a week in space up to the level that you expected to? We really didn't know how the body would sustain that long a period, and we had to know that in order to go to the moon.
Unfortunately for Frank Borman, this flight was primarily a medical experiment run by doctors.
One of the things that I learned in the NASA program is you give the doctors an inch, they'll take a mile. So I launched with an EEG, needles stuck in my head and everything else you could think of.
In 1965, Borman and Lovell were medical guinea pigs. They survived 14 days in weightless conditions, but even the doctors had no idea what would happen when they returned to gravity.
Yeah, they were concerned on landing that when all of a sudden our hearts were pumping a bud in a 1G environment that we might have problems or pass out. Some of them even thought we'd die, but we never even got dizzy.
I actually, for the first couple hours, actually had almost command my legs to say left, right, And my mother was watching on TV, and I later saw it on a film. It looks like I had my pants full because I was walking very, very, very deliberately.
One thing when they got back on the carrier they noticed is that all the other people smelled a little funny. They'd been cooped up in this front seat of a Volkswagen for 2 weeks. By the time they got out of it, I think they were very happy to get out of it, although they didn't probably realize how bad it had gotten.
So far, Gemini was a brilliant success. But the final challenge was to master movement outside the vessel. There was no point in going to the moon if you couldn't get out. NASA knew it, and so did the Russians. When cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first man to float in space, the race took on a new, risky dimension.
Every time I'd push or turn a valve, it would turn my entire body in zero gravity. I had nothing to hold on to. And we take for granted gravity because we can do that kind of work with ease if something is holding our feet to the ground. Nothing was holding me anywhere.
Working in space was proving a tremendous strain. Within minutes, Cernan was sweating profusely. It was not at all what he and his commander, Tom Stafford, were expecting.
In a few minutes, he fogged over. We were so naive, we didn't even think about putting defog on our visor like you do when you go snorkeling or scuba diving. And so he was huffing and puffing, and I was flying the spacecraft. He says, "Tom, I've got a hard time controlling myself."
And it was a very, in retrospect, somewhat of a hair-raising thing. And there were probably times where there were people down here on Earth wondered whether I'd get back in because my heart rate was running at 170 beats a minute.
So this is not a good situation at all.
NASA downplayed the concern, but hours before the flight began, Deke Slayton, head of the astronaut office, had spoken to Tom Stafford in private about the unthinkable.
Tommy says, NASA management wanted me to let you know if something happens to him out there, and if he dies, you've got to bring him back because we can't afford to have a dead astronaut floating around out there. I looked at him and I said, we've never talked about this before.
Cernan was fed oxygen from an umbilical hose that passed through an open hatch. Stafford had to pilot the spacecraft. He could not pull Cernan back in unaided, seat him and shut his hatch. The only way Stafford could possibly bring a dead Cernan back was to re-enter the atmosphere, trailing his corpse with the hatch still open.
The Gemini would be in front, but this thing is going to be whipping us all around. I says, and furthermore, I've got an open hatch, and all I have is this thin suit within just one layer of nylon, and I've got 3,200-degree plasma coming a couple of inches right above my shoulders through that open hatch. So he's got 7 layers of insulation. That's not going to help him too much. He's dead anyway, but I've got 1 layer here, and this plasma is going to come through the hatch. And then suppose we even get through all that, then a pilot chute comes out. Is that going to get snared with what's left of Cernan? And then here comes the main parachute out. Is that going to get snared and with what's left up there? And so here I'm going to plop down in the ocean with a hatch open. What happens then? And he says, well, what should I tell NASA management? And I said, probably I'll cut him loose. If he really is dead, I'll do all I can. But if he's dead, there's a good chance you're going to jeopardize the spacecraft and me too.
Stafford was just going to literally have to cut the cord, and I might still be a satellite out there traveling through the sky 20, 30 years later.
For Stafford, the unthinkable had become all too real. Forget the spacewalk. All he cared about now was saving Cernan's life.
So I called the ground and the contact said, I've called it quits. I'm going to get him back in before we go in the next night time. Got him in. Finally, he just couldn't hardly move. And then when he opened his visor, he was absolutely pink, like he'd been in a sauna. about an hour too long. The next day we landed, they flew the suit right back to Houston. They had over a pound or a pound and a half of water out of each boot. But he lost, I think, 10 and a half pounds in 2 hours and 5 minutes outside.
The next two attempts at extravehicular activity, EVA, were scarcely any better.
Everybody forgot Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. And when they touched the spacecraft repelled them.
As engineers, we started saying, look, we've had 3 missions where the EVAs didn't go well. What was wrong? Then we had a science advisory team step in and say, look, your entire principles of EVA are wrong. How you train, how you prepare the crew, the kinds of tools and instruments that you use.
The following capsule was equipped with special handholds and footholds to anchor the spacewalker in place. But the biggest improvement was neutral buoyancy training, practicing underwater, the closest environment on Earth to weightlessness. On the final Gemini flight, the new training and tools made all the difference. What had been nearly impossible was now easy for astronaut Buzz Aldrin.
I felt that it was a piece of cake outside, just moving very slowly. There was no challenge. Certain things come naturally. You decide that you're going to move in a certain way and you need leverage, so you just don't allow yourself to get out of position. And you know, it just takes a little bit of patience and understanding.
In November 1966, Gemini came to a triumphant finish. The unacknowledged heroes of NASA's afterthought had tested every technique Apollo would need to reach the moon.
We had to learn how to do all the things to prove that they could be done before we could even begin to think about going to the moon on Apollo. And Gemini, in its own historical context, was perhaps as important as Apollo, because without Gemini, there would have been no Apollo.
We had finally figured out how to do EVAs without fogging up the visors. We'd figured out how to do rendezvous. We figured out how to do long-duration flights.
Now, suppose we had never done any of this. Say, whoopee, we're going to the moon. And never done Gemini. It would have been a disaster.
But Gemini's success was no guarantee for the future. Locked away in an anonymous building at the Langley Research Center are the physical remains of one of the space race's darkest hours. The objects stored here have not been shown to the public in a decade. Once they were evidence. Today they are painful fragments of shattered dreams. In 1967, the high hopes of America's moon program were all riding on this spacecraft. Its maiden voyage, the first flight of Apollo, was supposed to bring the moon within easy reach. But it was not to be. 4 weeks before launch, this spacecraft was destroyed by fire. Tragedy not only claimed the lives of 3 astronauts, it also stole forever the innocence of everyone who worked on Apollo. In January 1967, just 10 weeks after Gemini ended, the new Apollo spacecraft prepared for its first test flight. The crew was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Chaffee was the new boy. This would be his first flight. Ed White had flown once in Gemini. He was the first American to walk in space. Gus Grissom, one of the Mercury 7, was the most experienced. This would be his third flight, and he intended to go even further.
Gus, what do you think your chances are for an Apollo flight?
I think they're pretty good. I expect to be around for most of the Apollo program.
You think you will one day make one of the trips to the moon, then?
I'm planning on it.
Shortly before launch, there were two critical tests. One was for leaks. The capsule was sealed and the pressure inside pumped up to see if it held. The second test was a practice countdown, a dress rehearsal for launch. The crew was in the capsule, the hatch sealed, and the spacecraft filled with pure oxygen. To save time, NASA did both these tests at once. They increased the pressure to 15 pounds per square inch, while the crew was inside in pure oxygen. The combination was lethal.
We had 15 psi of pure oxygen in that spacecraft. And at 15 psi of oxygen, aluminum burns.
After years of doing this test on every single Mercury and Gemini capsule, NASA had become complacent about pure oxygen at high pressure. On January the 27th, 1967, their luck ran out. There were communication problems, and Grissom was frustrated.
You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. I can't read you, Chuck. You want to try the phone? How are we going to get the moon? We can't talk between three buildings. I can't hear what you're saying. Jesus Christ. Did you guys talk together up there at the command module? I said, how are we going to get the moon? We can't talk between three buildings.
Ironically, the end of the test was to be an emergency escape drill, but it never got that far. At 6:31 p.m., somewhere in the miles of wire, a spark jumped.
I was looking at a TV on my launch director's console. I saw a flash, and the spacecraft really burst into flames.
We heard these screams in the intercom coming from the spacecraft, and we heard the people on the pad yelling about a fire.
In the high-pressure oxygen, the fire quickly became an inferno. Seated in the middle, Ed White was desperately trying to release the hatch, but the hatch opened inwards.
When the spacecraft was pressurized, there was no way Ed White could pull that hatch inward. I mean, there was tons of force holding that hatch closed.
It took pad technicians 5 minutes to get the hatch open.
And when they did, our crew had expired.
It was like a stomach punch for everyone in the program, and everybody, no matter what role they had or what part they had in it, I think had a sense of guilt about it.
Somewhere along the line, one of us must have missed something, and therefore we let our crew down.
Roger was so energetic, so enthusiastic about the whole program. And we're sure that as long as he had to leave this world, he's happy in his spaceship anyway.
No anger at what's down at Cape Kennedy? What will continue? What will follow?
None whatsoever. The price of progress comes high at times.
In the aftermath, NASA conducted a painstaking investigation. It found the spacecraft was full of design flaws and sloppy workmanship. Worst of all, poor quality wiring, the most likely cause of the fire. Over 100 design changes were made. A hatch that opened outwards in 7 seconds. Better shielding on wire. Better fireproofing. And for ground tests, no more pure oxygen. This spacecraft never left the ground, yet it may have contributed more than any other flight to the goal of reaching the moon.
I hesitate to say this, but I have to say it. I don't think we would have gotten to the moon in the 60s if we had not had the fire. That's a terrible thing to say, but I think it is true.
If that had happened while we were on the way to the moon, we'd have lost the crew, never heard from them again, and it would have been just a mystery hanging over the whole program, which would have caused an untold delay, and maybe even a cancellation.
No matter how improved the new spacecraft was, it still could not reach the moon without a huge and powerful rocket, the Saturn V. Mercury and Gemini had used reconfigured military rockets intended to carry warheads. The Saturn V was created solely to explore space. It was as tall as a 24-story building. It weighed over 2,500 metric tons, but over 90% of the weight was fuel. That fuel didn't last long. The 5 engines of its first stage burnt 15 tons a second. But in the race to beat the Russians, there'd been no time to test it in stages. The Saturn V was as powerful as a small nuclear bomb. Thousands of parts had to work perfectly or it could explode. Vast mechanisms had to function with split-second timing. A giant steel gantry wielded 9 enormous service arms. 5 remained connected until the rocket started to move. Under the launch tower, a huge flame deflector channeled exhaust to the sides. Without it, the hot gases would rebound and the rocket would destroy itself. 4 hold-down arms restrained the rocket until it had correct thrust. When the arms released, they all had to let go within 50 milliseconds, or the Saturn would tip over. Then the 5 remaining swing arms, 20 to 30 tons each, had to retract in seconds.
The bird had to climb some 2 inches before the arm starts to swing. And that's an emotional time, I must tell you.
By 1967, rocket and launch complex were ready.
T-minus 60 seconds.
On November the 9th at 7 a.m., Rocco Petroni's launch team lit the blue touch paper.
You count up, and at 6 seconds, roughly, you give the first signal to burn.
Five, 4, we have ignition.
When the engines had all reached correct thrust, the rocket sent a command, "Let me go." The hold-down arms released, the swing arms retracted. Shards of frozen air fell away, shattered as Saturn V rose on wings of fire.
You can see the triumph in some of our safe spaces when it actually went off properly.
I was with Werner and some of his team there, and they said, "We just can't believe it. It all worked."
To me, it was the opening of the space age. Once we had that bird launched, I knew then it was just a matter of time until we got to the moon.
The Saturn V had worked perfectly on its first unmanned test. In little more than a year, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell and Bill Anders would undertake the hazardous assignment accepted so lightly after the mysterious summons by their boss.
I did not have any idea until I walked into Slayton's office. Honest to God.
Well, let me ask you, what did he give you an option, or did he say the mission's been changed?
No, he said that the Russians, the CIA had heard that the Russians were going to launch before the end of the year, and that Lowe was coming up with this plan to send Apollo 8 to the moon, and what did I think about it? I thought, that's a hell of a good idea. It'd take me 30 seconds. I committed you guys on that.
See that, Bill? He said, hey, Bill and Jim would really love to do that.
3 days after leaving Earth, Apollo 8 was at its furthest. The moon was invisible, hidden in shadow, lost in total darkness.
It was very black. All there was we could see over our shoulder was a black hole with no stars. We assumed that was the moon. In fact, the only time of the flight that my hair kind of crawled on the back of my neck, going into this big black hole.
Mission planners had calculated the precise instant the crew should be able to see the moon emerge into sunlight, if everything was going smoothly.
One of the things that would tell us if we were on track or not was a certain point in the flight plan when we'd look down and see the sunrise impacting the lunar surface. And I remember the awe that I had for the people that had done all this calculation. At the exact second we were supposed to see it, there it was.
Something caught my eye out of my window. And these were the lunar mountains coming up the window.
It was the first time humans had ever gazed at the dark side of the moon.
It was a lot rougher than the front of the moon, the side that's always exposed to the Earth.
We were like three school kids looking into a candy store window. Our noses were pressed against the glass. We forgot the flight plan.
Then something happened that no one had predicted.
When I looked up and saw the Earth coming up on this very stark, beat-up lunar horizon, an Earth that was the only color that we could see, a very fragile-looking Earth, a very delicate-looking Earth, I was immediately almost overcome with the thought, you know, here we came all this way to the moon, and yet the most significant thing we're seeing is our own home planet, the Earth.
Their mission was to photograph the moon. Instead, all three men focused on the Earth. Bill Anders took the picture that showed humanity its home as it really is. Earthrise.
All of the views of the Earth from the moon have let the human race and its political leaders and its environmental leaders and its citizenry realize that we're all jammed together on one really kind of dinky little planet. And we better treat it and ourselves better, or we're not going to be here very long.
It was Christmas. NASA had planned a live television broadcast from around the moon.
We were told that we would have the largest audience that ever listened to a human voice when we made our TV broadcast from the moon on Christmas Eve. And the only instructions that we got from NASA, do something appropriate.
The largest audience in history. The first words from another world. The choice was a dilemma.
I didn't want to take the time to worry about that when we had so much else. And Cy Borgen, who was a friend of ours with the U.S. Information Agency, suggested, how about reading from Genesis? So that's how it happened.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. God divided the light from the darkness.
There's a lot of times in my life when I've been brought to tears by just the power, the immensity, the beauty of what we were doing. And this was one of those days.
And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
As soon as the thing was cut off, we talked to the ground. I said, "Did you get all that?" They said, "Yeah." "Did it come in fine?" "Yes." Okay, now give us the instructions for getting home.
Getting home depended on a single engine. There was no backup. If it failed, they'd be stuck at the moon without hope of rescue.
That caught my attention a lot. We knew we would be there forever if indeed that engine didn't work again. So that was a sobering thought.
All systems are go. Over. Roger, thank you, Houston. Apollo 8.
I think the premiere of all the tense moments was the burn to get us back out of lunar orbit. We only had a single engine to do that, and had it failed, we'd still be circling the moon. So I can assure you there were 6 eyeballs focused on those instruments. Well, we were talking about what we called the TEI burn, trans-Earth injection, and of course we spent 20 hours going around the moon, and we were all kind of tired, and so we were programming the computer to turn on the engine and get the proper attitude. And as we got around the backside, because this burn starts on the backside, so no one can hear us from the Earth, and on the computer it comes up a little sign that says, a couple of numbers, that essentially says, "Are you really sure that you want to make this maneuver? This is your last chance to make up a decision." So I said to Frank, "Hey, do we want to..." Frank says, "Push the button." I'll never forget that.
The engine fired. They headed back towards the Earth. Their course needed to be completely accurate. In 3 days, Apollo 8 would hit the Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour. They had to come in at exactly the right angle. Too shallow, and they would skip off like a stone on water. Too steep, and Apollo 8 would be incinerated.
And we had to come 240,000 miles to hit something that was a re-entry target about the size of a letter slot, seen from about 4 miles away. We had to slide the letter in that slot. And the initial throw was good enough that that letter went right through the middle of it.
On the re-entry, Bill hadn't flown before, so Lovell and I were kidding him all the time about how exciting the re-entry was going to be, and this and that and the other thing, and that don't worry, we were going to be all right. And then about halfway through the re-entry, the Apollo was so much more spectacular than Gemini, and that Lovell and I were both scared. We shut up. Yeah, you remember that?
With its Earthrise photograph and reading from Genesis, Apollo 8 struck a universal chord.
I think the high point of my space career was Apollo 8. I say that because we were the first 3 people to leave the Earth, to go to the moon, to see the moon, the far side, but also the first people to see the Earth as it really is.
It had accomplished its original mission too. It had reached the moon before the competition.
Realizing that we had done our job well, that we'd beat the Russians to the moon, and there was no doubt in my mind now that the rest of the program was going to work. I had a feeling almost of euphoria. I was so pleased. I was so thankful for, because let's face it, God must have been looking after us or we wouldn't have made it. So it was a very, very, very religious experience for me.
Bill had an interesting comment when we landed, because someone, while we were waiting to be picked up, someone had called from the ship or the helicopter and said, is the moon made out of green cheese?
Yeah.
And Bill says, nope, it's American cheese.
Geez, I remember that like yesterday.
Yeah.
The men of Apollo 8 stood on the shoulders of the unsung heroes of previous missions. The great dream lay within grasp, a man on the moon.
You can see the concluding part of Mission Impossible tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And Ford Walking on the Moon season continues next. Apollo 11 was halfway through its historic journey 30 years ago today. Real-time Apollo looks at events in space and here on Earth.